Welcome back to Bills in Business, a podcast that has guests in the Texas legislature and business community, all talking about the political shifts in shaping Texas. I'm your host, Laura Carr, co-founder of TXLege and TXLege News. Today we have a special episode for you as we look ahead to this upcoming general election. Joining me is Jeff Blaylock, the founder of TXElects and now our senior news editor at TXLege News. Jeff's a well-known elections expert with over 25 years experience in political analysis, campaigns, government, and advocacy. Here's our conversation. Jeff, I'm so glad to have you here. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And it's been so fun working with you, but I'm sure our viewers are going to love to hear all your thoughts about elections. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's glad to be here.
Yes. Well, how has it been being back in Texas?
It's always good to be back in Texas. I was in Austin for a number of years. So it's the blueberry in the bowl of tomato soup that is Texas. Since I wasn't in any competitive districts, I didn't get the same election run-up experience a lot of other people got. But now I'm in a swing congressional district in New Mexico. We get 20 mail pieces a day. We get 3 block walkers a day. We actually had to put a sign on the door that said we already voted, trying to keep the block walkers away. It kind of works, not always.
Good for them. Good for them. Appreciate the persistence. Well, I know that it's been on the top of everyone's mind lately, just the Texas Democrats' kind of historic losing streak in Texas. And I would really like to kind of dive deeper into that with you. So over the last decade, Democrats in Texas have faced a lot of challenges, especially winning statewide. And we have a lot of elections up now. Mm-hmm. So what do you see as the primary factors contributing to this trend we're seeing?
Well, we're going on 30 years if the trend holds through this election since a Democrat last won statewide in Texas. So that was 1994. Every other state in the country, including some that are far redder than Texas is, has elected a Democrat statewide since Texas last did it. Wow. I think the overall issue really for the Democrats is that the brand is broken in the state of Texas. For many years, Texas was blue in the modern sense of blue and red. And there was a lot of support for Democrats in rural areas of Texas. That is completely evaporated. And now the challenge is trying to overcome all those rural votes in the urban areas. And to this point, they have not found a formula to put together the right coalition of voters in the right numbers to overcome what is now a rural red wall.
We're seeing a lot of demographic shifts in Texas as well. I mean, I was someone who moved here from DC in 2021. We had a huge influx of people moving from all across the states and the world around that time as well. So how do you see that potentially impacting this election and then also into the future?
Well, certainly in every election, there are a number of new voters, actually a fairly large number in a state as large as Texas. But the issue is that they vote at such a much lower rate than folks who have been here and have been voting before. I used to think of it in this terms, like if you vote regularly, you're much more likely to vote again. That's a hashtag analysis there. Very smart stuff. And so folks who are new to the state, we don't have a record really to look at to see how they voted. What we do know is they don't vote anywhere near as often as to the same percentage as people who've been here before. And so if your coalition to win depends upon new voters, you need a very large number of them in order to get enough who actually vote to make any difference.
Well, then let's jump into the U.S. Senate race, which is really on a lot of people's minds. We've got Senator Ted Cruz and we got Representative Colin Allred. So let's talk a little bit more about that. What are your predictions and what are your thoughts on that election being close?
Well, I think the national narrative about it being close is a little off. I think it's not as close as folks are making it out to be, but it will probably be closer than most of the rest of the statewide races in the state. There's such a narrowing between the top and bottom performing people of any party in the state because of the prevalence of what we used to call single punch state party voting. That's gone, but the effects of it are still there in that we see a tremendous number of people who will vote only Republican or will vote only Democrat. And as long as there's not much crossover, there's not much independence in those votes, it just simply becomes which party's got more voters out there. And at the moment, and for quite some time now, it's been the Republican Party.
You mentioned this, you don't think it's going to be as close as people seem. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that the Beto O'Rourke Ted Cruz race was probably the high water mark for Democrats certainly in the last since 1998, so certainly in the last few years. And Beto had a lot more energy in that campaign. He had a fair amount more money and a lot more, just a lot better circumstance, given the fact that in 2018, Beto O'Rourke was running against a Trump White House and against that policy and those policies in Washington. Colin Allred is having to run away from the Biden White House. And so that dynamic alone, I think, is going to make this race farther apart than what happened in 2018. But there's also a little less money behind Allred. And I think just the overall conditions for Republicans in terms of having what I call that rural red wall, they're still there. So the fact that Colin Allred is a candidate hasn't changed that fact. There's still that million or so votes that has to be made up somewhere, and I don't see him doing it.
You mentioned the money in these elections, and I've noticed, the trends that we discuss all the time are Senator Ted Cruz has consistently not received as much campaign finance, donations. So what would you say is happening here, where a candidate is not receiving, as much money and being outperformed by the Democrat, yet still not winning?
Yeah, so money doesn't always buy everything.
Yeah.
And money helps, and generally speaking, the candidate with the most money tends to do fairly well. But in this case, we're not really talking about money; we're talking about party ID, and that's a much stronger force than campaign finances when it comes to a general election. If we're talking a primary election, the money has a lot to do with it. The candidate with the most campaign resources gets into the runoff or wins the primary outright at a very high rate. But now we're talking about party ID, and Beto O'Rourke spent $80 million in 2018 to finish 1.25 percentage points ahead of a Court of Criminal Appeals candidate who spent nothing.
Wow. Yeah. So speaking of those numbers, do you know those exactly from Beto O'Rourke's election and then Colin Allred's?
I know Beto's is 80.2. I think Collins is somewhere around 56, 58 million at this point, probably a little higher. I mentioned that report was from a few weeks ago. But that marginal spending doesn't seem to make any real difference with the party IDs being so strong for voters here in Texas.
Interesting. Well, in addition to the money and all those things, obviously we've had a lot of impacts in the statewide elections and the House and Senate with the school choice positions, and then also the historic impeachment trial of the Attorney General. So how have those affected the primary election all the way through to now, if any?
Well, they were quite a factor in the Republican primaries in particular. Those seem to be two very divisive issues. In the past, we have seen more conservative challengers to more moderate Republican incumbents, but there hasn't been a galvanizing issue. And this particular legislative session created two, as you pointed out, the school choice votes and the choice on the House side to impeach General Paxton and send those charges over to the Senate. Those became very important in terms of Republican challengers. We had 10 Republican incumbents ousted in the primary. We had 5 more ousted in the runoff. We had several others who just retired rather than face that kind of a primary election. So it was a huge force there. In terms of the general election, I don't believe that it's relevant, really. I mean, there are not most of the races where school choice in particular was a factor in the primary are in safe Republican districts now. So it won't be a factor in that case. You might see in a couple of cases where the districts are much closer in terms of their partisan balance. You could see some mailers about school choice for the Democratic side, being if this candidate over here is going to vote for this and we don't like it. But by and large, I don't think it's either of those is going to be an issue. When you look over at General Paxton in the impeachment, that was such a partisan issue. The Democrats were almost entirely behind it, in favor of it, and so that's now not even a factor.
Interesting. And I know that voter turnout has kind of shifted in the southern border and West Texas, a lot more conservative and on the Republican side. So how do you think that's going to change the landscape this election?
Well, I think it will continue. We've seen a rather dramatic shift in South Texas toward Republican candidates, even though Democrats are still winning in a lot of those counties. They're winning by far smaller margins. And I think in some cases that we will actually see Republicans overtake them in parts of South Texas. We already know that House District 80, which was represented by Tracy King, a Democrat from Batesville for a number of years, he stepped back, he retired, and that this district we now have rated as safe Republican because it is just in an area of rural South Texas that's very strongly Republican. So I think we will continue to see uh, South Texas become redder. And that adds to the challenge of the Democrats statewide because now they have to make up that vote deficit too. That used to be a vote surplus, and it's becoming a vote deficit that they will also have to find a way to make up in the cities. So far, they haven't been able to do that.
Interesting. And do you think that that is surely just border policy, or what do you think the reason for that is?
I think that's a lot of it. Yeah, I really do. The Republicans, particularly since 2016, have been able to use immigration and border situation, border politics to their advantage, and that seems to really be reflected in the votes that are going on down there and in the voter trends. I think that those voters seem to be really tired of what they perceive as a situation with the border and what they experience down there. And so that does seem to be a driving element in this change. And then you have a group of people that are by social and cultural tradition a little bit more conservative than some of the rest of the Democratic base. And so having them drift toward Republicans and in some cases move quite headlong into Republicans really makes sense from a value standpoint, even though for many, many decades they have been very strongly Democratic in their support up until about 2016.
Absolutely. And so we've kind of seen this trend of moving more conservative. What are your predictions for this election? We're seeing in the primary, we had what everyone was calling a bloodbath.
Yes.
Are you expecting anything like that this general election?
No, because there's not enough seats for that to even be possible. I said we've got so many seats in the legislature that are rated safe Republican or safe Democrat. Partisan control of the chambers is not in question. It's not in play. So with only a handful of seats that are available, there isn't really an opportunity for there to be a partisan bloodbath. The state's just simply not that competitive. So we might be talking about one or two or maybe three incumbents being defeated in this general election. All the action was in March and May.
Do you think there'll be any surprises at all?
There's always surprises, but sometimes the surprises there isn't a surprise. I think the surprise at this point would be, if we looked at like the Senate district with Morgan LaMantia running in South Texas, if that were like a 5 or 6 point victory for the Democrats, that I think would be surprising because I think it will be much closer than that, and it wouldn't surprise me to see Hinojosa win that seat. But I think generally speaking, unless there is a coalition of voters that doesn't typically vote, that turns out in inordinately larger numbers and all points in one direction, so all Republican or all Democrat, I don't see a really big surprise out there. It could still happen, of course. That's why they call them surprises.
Yes.
But that's just not what the numbers seem to be indicating. It's not what the voter trends have been. And if you have to rely on a coalition of voters who don't normally vote to win you elections, you're not going to win very many elections.
For sure. Well, going into kind of more of the legislative session, now knowing this landscape, what are your predictions for this upcoming session? What's on the agenda and most important?
What's on the agenda will be whatever's on primary voters' minds in March of 2026. I think that we've kind of established that that's where the action is in these districts. The fewer districts that are competitive in November, the more they become competitive in March. And so I believe that we will see a number of what I would consider to be, social conservative priorities, such as abortion restrictions, such as election security, such as school choice, and those kinds of issues that seem to move the electorate in March of this year, and we would project would move them again in March of 2026. So I think that's the starting point for the session, and then the budget, because you got to have one of those.
After this election, we know politics doesn't really stop.
Never.
So going into the speaker race, we've had a lot of new people put their hat in the ring for this election. What do you see the outcome there being? Any thoughts on predictions?
Well, the speaker's race is a bunch of inside baseball. This is not an election that the voters participate in directly because they have elected the people who make this choice, and the 150 members of the legislature will make it. We have the incumbent, Dade Phelan, and we have several challengers. Seem to be kind of coalescing around David Cook of Tarrant County, but it's a little early to kind of lock in that second challenger. But what folks should understand about a speaker's election is that all 150 members have a vote in this, not just one caucus or the other. So to the extent that the Democratic caucus, which will be in the mid 60s to upper 60s, to the extent that that caucus holds together, that's a very powerful block of votes to elect a speaker when you need a total of 76. So if Phelan can hang on to most or all of the Democratic bloc, he doesn't need a whole lot of the Republican caucus in order to keep the gavel, which means that anyone who's challenging him from the right needs almost the entire Republican caucus to hold together in order to get to 76. That may happen because, as I said, we've got the primary being the big driver. Folks already know that supporting Phelan will generate a primary opponent almost automatically on the Republican side. So that's a calculus that the members will have to make. So to get to 76, you would need almost the entire Republican caucus if you were challenging Phelan. So it won't be a Democratic speaker, but those Democrats still need to vote for somebody. Presumably, it would be Dade Phelan, or if one of the other candidates offers a better deal for them from a policy and chairmanship perspective. Pretty sure they won't. No one else will do that. That's part of the reason for challenging him in the first place, is to get rid of Democratic chairs and pursue a more conservative agenda. So that locks any challenger, whether it's David Cook or Tom Oliverson or someone else, into needing 76 out of the Republican caucus to get the gavel. That's a tall order. It's not impossible, but it's going to be a strong challenge for that candidate to do. And Phelan still has the power of incumbency and the ability to make promises to the Democratic caucus that his challenger probably can't make.
And what does that process look like come January 14th, beginning of session? What does the election process look like?
Well, sadly, the election for speaker is usually not dramatic at all because it's been nailed down, and so they are either voted in by acclamation or it's 146-2 or something like that. So I think all that inside baseball will happen before they convene, and we should enter the session with not only a good idea of who is speaker, but knowing who has the votes to be speaker. My guess is a number of candidates, including Cook, will have numbers and say they have numbers, and they may have been told by members that they have it. It's not unusual in a speaker's race for multiple candidates to have been told by at least 76 people that they have their vote. That's not how it's going to work in the end, but that's how it works in the beginning. But I think all that palace intrigue will have worked itself out before the session convenes, and I do see the House organizing itself along a fairly normal schedule. I don't think we'll see a situation like in the U.S. Congress where we went for several days and multiple speaker votes. It's just not where this chamber is. I think we'll have a speaker before the session begins. The bigger issue to me statewide isn't so much do we have a new speaker, it's if Trump is elected back to the White House, do we have a new attorney general or a new governor or a new lieutenant governor? Because there are promotions from the state offices up to the federal offices.
Reading my mind, Jeff, that is definitely what I was going to bring up. Was just this presidential election, how this is going to impact potentially the statewide races, and what that would even look like if there were some appointments, just like you mentioned, the attorney general getting appointed to a position in the federal government. What do you see there happening on the state level?
So part of that's going to depend entirely on which person is elevated. If it's the governor that's elevated, then it would be the lieutenant governor, Dan Patrick, would become governor, and then the senators would pick among their number a new lieutenant governor. If it is someone like General Abbott who's elevated, then Governor Abbott would get to choose a successor, which would give him considerable sway over what would happen next. And then that person would, along with the other statewide officers, be up for election in 2026. So the voters wouldn't have really an opportunity to have a say in that until that next election. So if assuming Abbott remains governor and it's someone else who's elevated, he has a lot of power and influence in that decision. If it's Abbott himself who's elevated, then it becomes more of the same insider baseball you see in the House happening in the Senate again.
How about the Attorney General? There's definitely been some talks of him being elevated if President Trump were to be reelected.
Certainly, and that would create an opening for Governor Abbott to raise someone else into that position, and that person would have a significant advantage toward keeping the office in 2026.
Interesting times we're in, a lot of unknowns.
Yes.
Any other thoughts to share before we wrap up today? It's been a pleasure having you on and talking, but any other thoughts on this upcoming election you want to share?
We've seen some fairly strong turnout so far in terms of early voting, and what we know is that people who have voted in the primaries are turning out in fairly large numbers compared to people who have not. And at this point, the Republican primary voters have about a 700,000 or so vote advantage over Democratic primary voters. And of course, it's not to say that that is the exact partisan balance of the vote, but it's very strong, I would suspect. So we're already seeing, as a significant number, a significant surplus of Republican vote in early voting. We also probably we will assume that the early vote is the high water mark for Democratic candidates in the election, because Republicans tend to turn out better on election day than Democrats do. So if we get to the end of early voting, we get to 7 o'clock on election day and the early numbers are out, that's probably the peak of where the Democrats are going to sit, and then they will start to drop down. So if they're already under 50, they won't get above 50. If they're above 50, then we have some interesting things to happen.
It's definitely going to be interesting on a federal level, on a statewide level, and I'm excited to see it and be live tweeting with you on election night.
Yep.
So I so appreciate you coming on and sharing all this. And Jeff, how can people find you if they want to hear more about you, other than TXLege News, where they can find you?
I'm on the Twitters at Jeff Blaylock, but I tend to focus that on fantasy football and the numbers there. It's also a numbers game, but I do some political stuff there. Of course, we'll be on election night.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for being on, and thanks for listening to Bills in Business, and look forward to having you back next time. Make sure to subscribe.